Now we're going to talk more about another scale that's very useful for improvisers. When you're improvising in the modes, maybe you found out already that although I know what the correct pitches are, and I know that the chord tones are the strong pitches and the other pitches are the weak pitches, and I can keep chord tones on beats and I can keep the weak pitches in between the beats, still sometimes I'm kind of unsuccessful coming up with a satisfying melodic line, especially kind of a moving bebop-y kind of a line. Let's look at some examples of that. Let's say, for example, that I've got a D minor 7th chord to a G7 to a C major, and I know that I would use Dorian to Mixolydian to Ionian, and all those notes work, but I might come up with a melodic line that sounds something like this. Kind of unsatisfying. The main reason that was unsatisfying, although I used the notes of Dorian and Mixolydian and Ionian, it was unsatisfying because I wasn't able to keep the proper tones on the beats and the weaker tones in between the beats. In fact, I even emphasized the weakest tone of the scale at the end. On that C major 7, I emphasized an F. So that's not really satisfying. So then we could go to the approach of, okay, well now keep the chord tones on the beats. So let's say, for example, I were to try another 2-5-1, G minor to C7 to F major, and I'll make sure that I keep a chord tone of G minor on beat 1 and 3, and a chord tone of C7 on 1 and 3, and a chord tone of F major 7 on 1 and 3. I might get a line that sounds something like this. Let's listen to that one more time. Here we go. Okay, so I'm keeping chord tones on beats 1 and 3, and other tones in between, but still it's kind of unsatisfying. It sounds like it doesn't have direction to it. It sounds like there's leaps in unusual places. I've still got some irregularity with weak tones being in strong places and all that. So that didn't really solve the problem. So let's say that I try to keep chord tones all the time. Let's do another 2-5-1, A minor to D7 to G major over the course of 4 measures, and we might get something like this. What I'm going to do is try to keep chord tones happening all the time. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, let's try that one more time. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, well, all chord tones, 8th notes, it's swinging well and everything, but still not a very satisfying melodic line, a bebop line. It doesn't sound like something jazz players would play. Too many chord tones, not enough direction in the melody. All release, no tension. So this next scale we're going to talk about helps to satisfy that problem of how to keep good tones in the good places and getting nice direction. And you'll still having some tension and having some release built into the scale. And these scales are called the bebop scales. We have 2 of them we're going to talk about today. Let's talk about this first one. Let's say we have a C dominant 7th chord. And the scale we would use for a C dominant 7th chord is a Mixolydian scale. Okay, so let's go ahead and try to create a 8th note line using the C Mixolydian scale, just running it up the scale. Okay, 8th notes. Okay, let's hear what that sounds like on a C7. 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, that doesn't sound too bad, but you can see that in the first measure it sounds pretty good. When we get to the second measure, though, we get weak tones happening on the strong beats. And part of the problem here is that, as with all modes and all diatonic scales, they're all 7 notes in length. And so if you're trying to run an 8th note line, you've got 7 notes that you're trying to fit into 8 places. So we don't have enough notes to make a complete 8th note line in just running up the scale on 8th notes. So we need 1 extra note we can squeeze in here. Remember, the idea is we're trying to keep chord tones on the beat. So we need our C, our E, our G, and our B flat on the beat. Well, they are on the beat, but the problem is that when we start over again, our C is starting too early here. So we need an extra half step in here. So you can see that if we just add an extra half step, between the seventh of this chord and the root of the next octave, putting a B natural in here, we add that extra little passing tone, that extra little half step that keeps the chord tones on the beats. Now we can run the bebop scale even in the downward direction. In the opposite direction, and that gets us a nice little bebop line just by running the scale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, we can do that from some different pitches too. So that's the C dominant bebop scale. You can see we've got chord tones happening on the beats, and we've got weak tones happening in between the beats. Just by running the scale, we get a pretty good bebop-y sounding line. Now, the good thing about the bebop scale is, okay, great, now I can run it up and down. Still doesn't sound very melodic. Well, the good thing is you can change direction at any point as long as you change direction on a chord tone and that chord tone is happening on a beat. So we could come up with a longer line. Let's look at example 6 there. And you see a longer line where I've actually started in a downward direction. But when I get to the third scale degree, or the third chord factor, I go upwards in another direction until I get to the seventh scale degree, or the seventh chord factor, come down all the way until I get to 5 low, come up to 3. As long as you change direction on 1, 3, 5, or 7, and as long as that's happening on a beat, you're going to get a nice sounding bebop line. Here's what it sounds like. A 1, 2, 3, 4. One more time. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, all I'm doing here is running this bebop scale up and down, changing direction on chord tones. Really not an incredible amount of creativity here, other than the fact that I'm just deciding to choose a chord tone at a different place. I could choose to go down to 3 and up to 5 and down to 1 and up to 7. There's all kinds of ways you can practice this. You can start on the root and play up to the 5th. When you get there, come down to the 3rd. When you get there, go up to the 7th. When you get there, go down to the 5th. And run that. That's what we call up 5, down 3. But you can see you can get a lot of mileage out of it. I can actually have C7 for 8 measures and just run the bebop scale, changing direction on the chord tones, and get something that sounds pretty good. A 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. Now remember, this is not a new mode. So this is not a scale that we can just be melodically creative with and jump all around however we want to. When we talked about Mixolydian, we could be creative with that melodically. That was C Mixolydian. With the bebop scale, this doesn't say that all of a sudden now you have a new note that you can just be creative with. Where people sort of get stuck with the bebop scale is they start to say, okay, now I've got 8 notes that I can improvise melodically with. And this can sound very bad if you just jump around however you want to with the bebop scale. Here's a bouncing around on the bebop scale. You can see that that new note really doesn't sound good to emphasize, and it still doesn't sound too great to overly emphasize the 2nd, 4th, and 6th. So remember, this bebop scale, you want to keep it moving stepwise and change direction on chord tones. So that's our C dominant bebop scale. Okay. Now let's look at another one. So that works great for dominant. What about other types of chords like major? Let's look at the same problem we would have for major. So the major scale is a diatonic scale, so it's got 7 notes in it, 7 letters to our musical alphabet. So let's go ahead and put that Ionian mode up here and just run it in 8th notes. Okay, there we go. C major 7 this time. Okay, let's see what that sounds like. A A 1, 2, 3, 4. Or in a downward direction. You know, either way you get it. When you get to that second octave in this one, we've started to emphasize 2, 4, and 6. Or when I come down that scale, in the first octave, I'm actually accenting or accenting 6, 4, and 2 on the way down on the beats. So once again, we've got the kind of out of sync with the weak tones being in the strong places. So we need to add an extra tone here. Well, this one's a little more difficult because you can see that we've got 1, 3, 5, and 7 on the beats there. And we need to add an extra tone. Well, in the bebop scale, we added an extra pitch in between 7 and 8. We don't have that ability to do that on the major bebop scale because there is no half step here. So we need to put a half step someplace else. Well, a couple ways of thinking about this. The half step that we add here is right here at the raised 5. Now at least we get 1, 3, 5, and 6, which is a nice alternative to the 7 happening on the beats in the second octave. We can do that same thing. In fact, let's run it in downward direction. There we go. You can see I call it a G sharp on the way up and an A flat on the way down. That's just for ease of reading. So here's our major bebop scale. Okay, sounds good on a major 7th chord. Once again, that's the C major bebop scale. I talked about 2 ways of thinking about it. One is to keep that 1, 3, 5, and 6 on the beat. The other one is when you look at the strong pitches, you've got C, E, G, and A. That's a C major 6th chord. And the notes in between, G sharp, B, D, G sharp, B, D, and F. That sort of creates a diminished chord built on the leading tone. So you've got a C 6th and you've got a B diminished. And so in effect what you're doing is going back and forth between chord tones of the C 6th and the B diminished 7th. We've got C 6th, B diminished, C 6th, B diminished, C 6th, B diminished, C 6th, B diminished. So in other words, it's taking those 2 chords, C 6 and D diminished, putting them together to create a scale. And so you get that feeling of home or release on the C 6th and tension on the B diminished chords put together that way. So that's our major bebop scale. Has the same properties of dominant bebop scale. As long as you're running it stepwise, and as long as you're keeping chord tones on the beats, and you can change direction at any time on any of these chord tones, 1, 3, 5, or 6. You can change direction, just make sure you keep those chord tones on the beats. So you get maybe a long phrase. Let's see, let's look at example number 9 there. Sounds something like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. One more time. 2, 3, 4. Now we can make it more elaborate. I could have C major 7 for 8 measures. Just change direction on a chord tone and keep them on the beats. Now, I don't have to do an endless string of eighth notes. I can put breaks in there. Okay, I can even start on an upbeat as long as when I'm starting in between the beats, I'm starting on one of the weak tones. Okay, and that keeps 1, 3, 5, and 6 on the beat and the weak tones in between. Now, what about other types of chords? What about a minor chord? Well, we can look at a minor chord in 2 different ways. One, a minor chord that's functioning like a 2, like it's part of a 2-5-1, or a 1 chord that's functioning like a 1, like it's a 1 chord in a minor key. Let's look at the first way first. Let's say I have a G minor 7th chord. Well, let's say I have a G minor 7th chord that's functioning like a 2 or kind of functioning like Dorian. Well, we really don't have a minor bebop scale for chords that function like 2. What we do is we use its sister, which is that 5. So I would look at that G minor 7th and just think of it as a C7 and use the notes of a C dominant bebop scale on the G minor 7. So if I have G minor, I might play something like this. Okay, so what I've done here is used all the notes of the C dominant bebop scale, keeping the notes of the C7 on the strong beats, and we'll play it over the G minor 7. Here's what the phrase sounds like. Okay, sounds great on a C7. And let's hear it over the G minor. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so you can hear that sounds pretty good. Because we've linked that G minor to that C7th chord in a 2-5, and they sound like sisters, whatever we think on the G minor we can use on a C7, and whatever we think on a C7 we can use on a G minor. So they're kind of put together that way. So here's the example from the book. That was a 2-5-1. But you can see that we're thinking C dominant bebop scale on the G minor, and then moving to F major bebop on the F major. Now, you can mix this in with arpeggiating chords. I could arpeggiate chord tones of the G minor 7 and then break into the C dominant bebop scale. I could then arpeggiate an F major 7. I can do all kinds of things. Remember, arpeggiating the chord always sounds good. You just don't want to do it too much or it'll sound too inside. You want to have some tension to go along with that release. Let's look at example number 11. This gives a little phrase that goes from an A minor to a D7 to a G major, uses some arpeggiation as well as using the bebop scale. A minor, D7, G major. A 1, 2, 3, 4. One more time. A 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, arpeggiating the chord and the bebop scale both. Now, I said there's two ways to think of a minor chord. One, I look at that G minor chord and I think of it as being associated as part of a 2-5, and then whatever I would do on a C dominant bebop scale, I do that on the G minor. But the other way we have is a minor chord that's actually acting more like a 1 chord in a minor key. Quite frequently you see that as a 6-9. Well, the notes of a G minor 6 are G, B flat, D, and E. G, B flat, D, and E. Those are the notes we want to keep. Okay? And then if we go down a half step, and remember how we talked about on that C7, if you're going to go down a half step and build a B diminished chord, let's go down a half step from this and build a fully diminished chord and put those notes in between. So in between that, we're going to put the notes of an F sharp fully diminished 7th chord. Okay, so that means that we're going to put F sharp, which is going to be up here, and A, and C, and E flat, but we're going to call it a D sharp in between there. And we get what sometimes is called the minor bebop scale. That's a nice sounding scale too. Huh. Okay, this is a nice sound, especially if you got a G minor chord for a long period of time that isn't a modal sound, or it's a 1 chord in a minor key. So this one has it's like a Dorian. Let's see, how would you look at this one? This one might be, I'd say major bebop scale with a lowered 3 is probably the easiest way to think of that one. Okay, so that's what we might call the minor bebop scale. Okay, so let's build a couple of these scales and write a little 2-5 using these bebop scales. Okay, so we want to build a few. Let's build a B flat dominant bebop scale. B flat dominant bebop. Okay, we're obviously going to start on B flat. Remember, the dominant bebop scale is like a major scale, and you're going to add a lowered 7th in between it. That's probably the easiest way to think of it. So the B flat major scale. There we go. Okay, and then we're going to add that lowered 7th scale degree. A is 7, so we're going to add that lowered 7, and there it is as an A flat. That would also work on an F minor 7th chord, B flat 7 and F minor. Okay. Now, let's try building a major bebop scale. The major bebop scale, you're going to write a major scale and add a raised 5th. Don't replace the 5th, but add a raised 5th in there. How about the A major bebop scale? Well, the A major scale is A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp. Hang on, leave myself a little space here. F sharp and G sharp. Okay. Now we're going to add in the raised 5th scale degree, which means we're going to add an E sharp in there. Okay, we're raising the 5th, so that would be an E sharp. Good. And that's what's going to sound good on an A major 7th chord. Okay, major bebop scale. Streams of 8th notes, keep the chord tones on the beats, especially in this case 1, 3, 5, and 6. Put some spaces in there. If you pick it up, make sure you start on a chord tone or start on a weak tone in between the beats. And now let's try building maybe a little 2-5-1 using the bebop scales. Okay, so let's say I've got a 2-5-1. Actually, I'm going to give myself a little more room here. Okay, and I've got D minor to G7 to C major. Okay, remember, D minor G7 is a 2-5, so over this entire 2-5 I'm going to use the G dominant bebop scale. And then over the last two measures I'm going to use the C major bebop scale. So I could do strings of 8th notes, I could arpeggiate the chord. Maybe what I'll do here is do something like this. Start on the G, and just go straight up the G dominant bebop scale. I ran out of room, so I'm going to stop right there on the D. Then I'm going to pick it up from the D again and go down the G dominant bebop scale. Remember, this is going to have a G major scale with an added 7, so I'm going to go F sharp, F natural, okay, had too many pitches there, get that D out of there. Alright, so far I've got this. Okay, alright. Now, the C major bebop scale, I've got to have a C, E, G, or an A on the beats. So I've kind of put myself in a hole here because I'm ending on an E and I need to start again. It doesn't sound great to repeat that pitch. Okay, so I think I'm just going to leave a rest there at this point and pick it up on a weak tone of that scale, not the C, E, G, or A. I'm going to pick it up on a D, F, G sharp, or a B. So I'll pick it up on the F and go in the opposite direction. Now, remember I'm going to go 4-5. Now this has got the C major scale with a raised 5, right? So I'm going to use the C major scale but add a G sharp in here. Give myself a little break there. And then maybe pick it up on a different chord tone. Go back up to E and come down the bebop scale. I'm doing this in a very analytical kind of way. I mean, of course, you mess around with the scale for a while first and get comfortable with the sound. And then after a while, you kind of hear the sound in your ear and you don't have to hear everything. But anyway, so what I've done here is straight up the G dominant bebop scale, come down the G dominant bebop scale, but then I got myself in trouble by ending on the E, so I gave myself a little rest, started on a non-chord tone on the upbeat, went up the bebop scale till I got to C, and then just arbitrarily decided to start on another chord tone and come down. So altogether we get something that sounds like this. One more time. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, that's that's an example of how to use the bebop scale through an entire 2/5. You'll have the opportunity to use this bebop scale in the tune we're studying this unit, and make sure that you remember those main things. Dominant bebop scale, major scale with a lowered 7, use it on dominant chords. A dominant bebop scale can also be used on its related 2, not its parallel 2, but whatever 2 makes a 2/5 out of that. We can also use the major bebop scale on a major chord. And you might not find the opportunity to use the minor bebop scale, but remember that one. It's like a minor 6th chord with all the notes of a diminished chord a half step below in between. And you can also try some exercises with the bebop scale. Up 5, down 3. This is a great skill to develop, playing over dominant and major chords for a long period of time. So have fun with this bebop scale, especially on the tune we're doing for this unit.